Update. It's been almost a week since my last update here.
Again, we have a bunch of topics to dive into.
So let's go ahead and get straight into it. So I left you in my
with the
last
news
video
that we had a hypervisor exploit from Spectre.
that wasn't released at that time, still isn't released right now. But now we have more information
About
when that is going to come out, because Spectre is going to be doing a presentation at this year's Hardware.io conference, which kind of has a lot of history with PlayStation hacking, with Spectre doing a talk here previously. And we also had the floor revealing his exploit chain with the Blu-ray drive at a Hardware.io conference as well. So the title of the talk is by Provisor, How We Broke the PS5 Hypervisor. Although a kernel exploit for the PS5 for years, the hypervisor-based security architecture has largely succeeded in preventing reverse engineering of the system and maintaining kernel integrity across all firmware versions until now. We will explore methods used to circumvent the hypervisor, enabling custom code execution and system library decryption. We will reveal to previously undisclosed vulnerabilities in the hypervisor firmware versions to 250, which can be exploited for a full hypervisor compromise, and the bypass of execute-only memory protection. Furthermore, we will release scripts to assist in reverse engineering the system, which will be made publicly available following the presentation. So there's a couple of good nuggets of information there that this hypervisor exploit is gonna work up to 2.50. So we know for sure now it's gonna work up to 2.50 as the highest firmware for this hypervisor exploit. He also says here he will reveal to previously undisclosed vulnerabilities in the hypervisor firmware versions up to 2.50, and he will also be releasing scripts to assist in reverse engineering of the system, which will also be very useful for future exploitation. So it's good to see that we'll be revealing this hypervisor exploit at this conference, and we don't have long to wait because it's placed on the 21st to the 25th of October. So only a few weeks before we will get to see this. Now, another thing that seems to be making the rounds recently is a proprietary code that does not exist in normal BSD systems. So this is some kind of proprietary code that is being used in, I believe, PS4 firmware. 11.52 has been compared to 12.0, and there's been some differences made in this code from 11.52 to 12.0 as far as I can tell, and apparently there is some kind of bug in this code that might be exploitable, although we're not sure at this stage. Also, we don't know if this affects the PS5, and if so, what firmware, and because it may not have existed in an older firmware. So yeah, we'll have to wait and see on this. Very much really information on this right now. Speculate so too much at this point, but we'll see if this develops into anything particularly useful. So there's been some developments for those on 6.x and 7.x firmwares in the form of an implementation of the UMTX exploit with the Blu-ray drive exploit BDJ in the form of the jar loader from Hammer-883. So the jar loader has existed for a long time. You can see it goes all the way back to November 2023. And this just uses the Blu-ray drive exploit on its own to run things like an FTP server that is sandbox, so it only has access to the directory of the app that it's running within. And we've had access to that for well over a year. That is not anything new, but what is new is in the more recent builds. We got the release of the UMTX bug that has been implemented here, so you can actually send a jar file version of the UMTX exploit that Flat's released a couple of weeks ago that seemed to be incomplete. It appears that they've managed to get it loaded here using the jar loader. So what's interesting about this is that very recently, just in the past couple of hours, there's been a version to release which goes a step further and actually is starting to get a little bit more stable. The reason why I never when it first launched with the version 1.2 version is that it didn't really do anything. It would just crash every time you loaded it. And it looks like things are getting a little bit more stable now. So right here we've got version 2. Now running this, it says UMTX bug implementations from and cryptogenic adapted to this STK. Note that stability is not guaranteed and BDJ eventually kernel panics are expected. Some of the post-exploitation steps are currently only on 1.0 to firmware, and exploit may not work at all on firmware's 3.0 plus. So essentially this is getting mainly tested right now on firmware's 1.x and 2.x, because those are easier to implement the kernel exploit on, because they don't have those additional mitigations that Spectre was talking about on 3.x and higher. So this will likely get ported from the older firmwares up. So yeah, this may take a little while at the moment, moment it looks like. Hammer 83's managed to get it pretty much all the way through to completion, and even loading payloads on the older firmwares like 1.x firmwares. But eventually, it's gonna get ported to higher firmware. Most likely, if you try and run it right now, panic for most people on most firmwares, especially if you're on a firmware higher than 2.x, like 6.x or 7.x. But this is a good step in the right direction. We're finally getting an implementation now of the kernel exploit that will work on 6.x and 7.x in future. And this is the beginning stages of that. If you want to set this up, all you have to do is go ahead and download the PS5 jar loader to 0.0.0.eso. So you download the ESO file. If you've been using the older version, 1.1.2, you will need to burn the new version to your Blu-ray disc, which is why I recommend having BD-RE rewritable discs so you can write updates to the disc as things get improved. So what you want to do is download the ESO file. You can use a program like Image Burn on Windows. To burn that to your Blu-ray disc, you just open the ESO and Image Burn, and you write it to the disc. Once you've done that, you can pop that disc into your PS5. Once it runs, it should be listening on a port 9.0 for you to send a jar file. At which point, you can then go ahead and send the UMTX 1.0 snapshot.jar with a payload injector. You can use Netcat GUI, although it doesn't accept jar files, it will give you an error. You just need to change the .jar extension to .bin or .elf, and just rename it so it's a different file type, and then you'll be able to load it into Netcat GUI and send it using port 9.0 and entering the IP address of your PS5 in the IP box, and then that will start running the exploit so you can see it running through here. So I've been testing it on my 2.30 PS5 because that should theoretically be a more stable firmware to try and run this on then right now. 3.x firmware or higher. But you know, once stability is proved out, it'll eventually get ported to these higher firmwares. And in the meantime, of course, Flats could come in at any point and release implementation of the Blu-ray drive exploit with UMTX, which he has stated his intention to do once he returns. So at any point, we could get that, but in the meantime, we'll keep an eye on the development. It's still not in a usable state yet for most firmwares, but it will eventually get ported to higher firmwares, I'm sure. Now, I have actually managed to get it to run where through it seems to achieve kernel read-write, but obviously, it doesn't do anything. After that, at this point, it doesn't load any payloads or do anything like that that appears to only be on 1.0 to right now, which must be the firmware that Hammer 83 is developing. Hopefully, it on. We will get better stability on higher firmwares as well as payloads eventually to make this into a usable exploit. Now moving back to the WebKit implementation of the UMTX exploit. One of the problems that has now been fixed was the issue of not being able to install files with the package installer in the debug settings. It turns out it wasn't setting the target ID correctly, and there was some address that wasn't right. So anyway, that's now been resolved. So it looks like we can now install packages SOPS for fake packages or web browser shortcut packages to get easier access to the web browser. That is now possible. I'll leave a link to my shortcuts for idle sources host down in the description, which also has URL redirectors so that you can access any website from there. You can just install that package from a USB. And all of the main hosts that were hosting the UMTX exploit have been updated at this point to include that fixed version, so if you were having installing package files before with the debug settings using the UMTX it should now be resolved. But of course, you will not be able to run any fake packages until we get the PS5K stuff of payload ported to other firmwares like 1.x to .x and 5.x. All of those firmwares need to be ported. So it looks like the next step is going to be getting the porting tool up and running and setting that up so that people on these firmwares, you can run the porting script, get all of the necessary offsets, and send them to the developers so that they can add support for your firmware version for the PS5K stuff. So that's pretty much where we're at right now. And we'll see how things develop over the next couple of days. So a couple of other quick Master updates. S9 released a PS5 package creation which can make it easy to generate shortcut packages that you can install on the PS5 to access certain settings or to access a specific website where you just select it on the PS-1 home menu and it will launch you onto that site through the browser or access that specific setting. So that is a handy thing that has been released. We also have the release of IdleSauce's PS5 exploit host tool, which will allow you to host the exploit offline. Now, it currently doesn't support the UMTX
Yet,
exploit,
but that will be added, so that should be pretty
caught
much
up to
everything.
at this point, I'm sure. Because it's the weekend, we might get some other things
So
very
I'll
soon.
keep you guys posted.
But anyway, that's it for this one.
Enjoyed
Hope you
this
guys
video or found
useful.
the information.
If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and